The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 16th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint the body of Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, here is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The Gospel of the Lord. So, there are some things, they just seem to go together. Peanut butter and jelly, Abbott and Costello. And although it makes no logical sense, Easter bunnies and Easter eggs. But as the Easter Gospel concludes this morning, Mark, the evangelist, puts two things together that do not seem to go together: terror and amazement. So Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salome, went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. Terror and amazement. They just don't seem like they go together. If you're amazed, why are you terrified? And if you're terrified, it usually overwhelms your senses so that you really don't have much emotional bandwidth left to be amazed at anything. And yet, that is occasionally the way it is in our lives. It doesn't happen all the time, but there are moments, and often they're significant moments. I know of times when I have been with new parents, and they are amazed at this new life that has just come into the world, but often, especially the first time around, it's also terrifying. Oh my gosh, are we going to do this parenting thing right? And how would we even know if we were doing it right? It is amazing, but it's also, in a sense, terrifying. Maybe that's happened in your life. And then again, I know of times when somebody has finally landed a new and exciting job. It is amazing because they have the opportunity to do things they have never done before, to make a difference in the lives of people around them, and maybe even change the world. But it can also be a little terrifying. Here I am, in a position of great responsibility, but I've never actually done this before. People are counting on me, and there will surely be challenges ahead that I don't know about. It can be a little terrifying. Maybe that's happened in your life. And I know of times when I have been with somebody who, after a long period of very careful planning and saving, reaches retirement. It is amazing because of all kinds of new opportunities that lie ahead. The chance to invest yourself in activities and relationships that maybe you didn't have time for when you were working. And yet, it can also be a little terrifying. I remember one retiring pastor buddy a few years ago who said, I know that I am set, and the financial planners also promise me that I am in great shape. But when that paycheck actually stops, it can be a little terrifying. Maybe that's happened in your life. Terror and amazement. They actually do sometimes go together. And they often go together at moments that are particularly significant and often life-changing. And I point this out because sometimes we read this gospel ending and think that it's not very meaningful. After all, the risen Jesus never actually appears. There is no scene where the women report the news to the rest of the disciples, although clearly they must have, or we wouldn't know about it. And while the angel tells them that Jesus will go ahead of them to Galilee and that's where they're going to see them, Mark's gospel ends before that happens. It's no wonder that later scribes added stuff to the end of Mark's gospel because it seems to lack something. And so we often pass over this terror and amazement stuff as though it was just the prelude to something more important that was either lost in transmission or which Mark chose not to include. But maybe terror and amazement are part of the point of the resurrection. That is, sometimes we read this gospel and figure that terror and amazement mean the women didn't understand what was really happening. And indeed, in Mark's gospel, all of Jesus' disciples are terminally clueless. But perhaps here, in the very last verses, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome do understand at last. Or at least they begin to understand in a way that none of them had before. Perhaps they were amazed because Jesus' words suddenly started to make sense. He really was talking about dying and being raised up. New life wasn't just a metaphor, but an actual reality they were beginning to experience, not just for Jesus, but for themselves. And that meant that they also were being called forward into a new life of promise and hope that would not end with the grave for them either. It was amazing. But that also meant it would be terrifying. What would that new life mean for them? What would the risen Jesus call them to do when they finally saw him? And how would they be received by others if they started talking about this amazing, but let's face it, for most people, unbelievable story? If they thought about it for very long, this amazing news was also kind of terrifying. So maybe the women did get it. And it shows because they were seized by terror and amazement, even if they didn't get to see Jesus that morning. Or maybe that is the way they saw Jesus, or at least experienced the risen Jesus' presence. Mark says that they were seized by terror and amazement, but maybe terror and amazement was the reaction that they had because in one sense, they were actually seized by the risen Jesus himself. Even though they didn't see him physically, the resurrection had become real to them. Even though they didn't see him physically, in that moment, they felt the presence of the risen Jesus. And even if they were still waiting to see him physically later on in Galilee, they knew the risen Jesus was running alongside them, even in the midst of their terror and their amazement. Maybe they were seized by terror and amazement because the resurrection in that moment had become real to them. It was not just a nice idea of life after death someday in heaven. It was happening now, and it was happening to them. And the risen Jesus was somehow present with them, even if they didn't see him physically. And actually, that is the point of Easter. So on this Easter, may you also be seized by the risen Jesus, so much so that it causes you to feel some terror and amazement in your life. Like those women, may the risen Jesus be a reality in your life and not just a Bible story. May you feel the presence of the risen Jesus in your life right now, even if you don't see him physically standing in front of you. And may you know the accompaniment of Jesus running along beside you always, no matter how you're feeling at the moment and in all situations.